More on the Russian strikes and how it's influencing the dynamics of the campaign against ISIL. We're joined by two guests. Joshua Cohen is a former project officer at USAID. He was involved in managing economic reform projects in the former Soviet Union. And George Jatras is with us. He's deputy director of the American Institute in Ukraine. It's great to have both of you on the broadcast.
Thank you.
Our Monitor recently had a piece titled Russia Gets Back in the Game. The piece by Sophie Pilgrim said Western diplomats have been forced back to the drawing board, knocked off balance by Moscow's whirlwind performance. And it goes on to say that Moscow both humiliated and courted its Western rivals at the UNGA. So let's talk about Putin, and I'll start with you, Josh. Was this a masterstroke or a miscalculation? How do you view it?
You know, it initially looked certainly like in the short term a masterstroke, right? I mean, he's jumped back in the game. He's supporting Assad. He's simultaneously putting a thumb in Obama's eye. He's essentially creating a new sort of de facto alliance, a Shiite Russian alliance with Russia, Iraq, Iran, and Syria. So certainly at first glance, it looks like a master strike. Over the medium to long term, though, how does it work out for Russia? There's a lot that could go wrong, right? They could be dragged into a quagmire. Financially, their economy is doing very poorly. They already are becoming right up there with us, even in just a few days, as a leading target for Sunni jihadists. So it looks like a good move initially, but we're going to have to see how it plays out.
Jim, what's your thought?
I think that's right. I mean, we're only, day 5 of this, so we really don't know how this is going to work out in the long run. I'm a little more optimistic about how it might go for them, in the sense that they seem to be hitting some of these targets a lot harder, frankly, than we have been. You sort of wonder why, after more than a year of an American-led effort, we haven't hit, for example, ISIS in Palmyra or at Deir Hafer near Aleppo, where they're confronting Syrian army troops. And I get the impression maybe we don't want to, that there's still too many people in this town, and frankly our Saudi and Turkish allies who are supporting the jihadists in Syria, who think of ISIS as more of a frenemy than an enemy, that they are more concerned about getting rid of Assad and not really that concerned about ISIS.
Yeah, what about Nathan's point that Putin comes in with the air of legitimacy? He was invited in, the West, the United States, not so. Does that play to his advantage?
I think it does to a certain extent, right? You know, and that's the point that Putin is making over and over again, that Assad is the legitimate president of Syria, whatever the West may say. The West has not been, and the United States have not been invited, whereas Russia officially has. So whatever we may think about Assad, and he's a bad guy who's done some bad things, but he is still recognized as the president of Syria, and they invited the Russians in.
It seems like there's a lot of bad guys, though, in Syria. And you know, it's interesting they keep talking about the good guys. When you look at the landscape, there aren't very many of them. There's a lot of different groups, and many of them very radical.
We've spent several years looking for good guys to arm, right? And certainly had a lot of trouble.
And some people, you know, throw this at the Russians and say, well, you're just trying to make it a choice between Assad or ISIS. Well, okay, maybe it's not ISIS, maybe it's the Al-Qaeda affiliate al-Nusra, maybe it's the Army of Conquest. But any way you cut it, it doesn't seem to be that there's any kind of democratic, Jeffersonian, human rights respecting group that is capable of taking power. And if that's the choice, Assad or one of these really radical jihadi groups, I don't think there's much choice, and I don't think President el-Sisi in Egypt think there's much of a choice. He's endorsed the Russian action. Our Kurdish friends are reportedly on board. It seems to me there are a lot of people in the region who think this is not the worst thing.
Let me, I want to, one quote that kind of jumped off the pages the other day. Mark Galeotti is an expert on Russian security affairs at New York University. He's quoted recently as saying, after the initial anger and perplexity wears off, Americans may see certain value in Russia taking the lead in Syria, especially when the U.S. is not in any position to do anything about it anyway. Is that a pretty clear?
It's actually a legitimate point. I mean, as Jim was saying, we don't, at present, we don't have a real policy, right? And Obama's instinct, I think particularly after Libya and what he's seen the Bush administration do for many years, has always been to take more of the realist approach and to take more of a conservative approach. He's been resisting a no-fly zone. I think that's increasingly his instinct globally. So to a certain extent, letting the Russians force the action a bit, it's not the worst thing. right?
Some people can't take good news for an answer. I mean, it's if somebody else is going to take the risks and bear the costs and hit some very bad people, and it doesn't have to be us. Why is that a bad thing?
Yeah, well, let me ask you about the episode with Turkey. We also heard this story today that the U.S. rerouted one of their flights. It's pretty congested there. There is the opportunity for miscalculations or problems. How do the two of you view that?
I think it's a real issue, right? I mean, and it is going to require careful coordination. I mean, I was a couple days ago, a U.S. and Russian jet passed within 20 miles of each other. There's certainly potential for problems with Turkey, and I wouldn't count out the dark horse in this are the Israelis, because they've hit targets in Syria 9 or 10 times. They have a red line about weapons going to Hezbollah. I think they're going to continue to enforce that red line. What happens if an Israeli plane comes within close contact of a Russian plane? What happens if there's another Israeli strike and Russians are accidentally, military troops are actually killed on the ground? So there's a lot of things that could go wrong with a number of actors over the skies of Syria.
How do you thread that needle?
Well, I think coordination is the key. I mean, we know Prime Minister Netanyahu went to Moscow. He talked to Putin. I think he talked about those red lines. I don't know what kind of assurances he got, but I think the only way we can work through this is to accept the Russians are going to do what they're going to do, that it could be beneficial to us if it works out for them. We should be coordinating with it, because what we're doing is not getting the job done. And some of these irresponsible calls by some American politicians say we should be arming, quote, our rebels so they can shoot down the Russian planes, or we should have even been confronting the Russians in the air. You wonder what they're thinking, really. I mean, how does that serve the American interest? I don't see that it does.
Let me ask you about these complaints about Russia not hitting the right targets, and there's been a lot of that, and pouring gasoline on the fire, that sort of thing. I want to get your thoughts from both of you. You know, Turkey entered into all of this. They were going to target ISIS, and yet most of their sorties initially, they were going after the Kurds, the PKK.
Absolutely.
No one really complained about that. And then for the United States also at this point in time, to talk about civilian casualties after what we saw in Afghanistan, where a hospital was hit. How do you balance that as a message if you're the U.S.?
It's a very hard thing to balance, right? And I mean, yes, I think it's undoubtedly true, particularly in the initial days. I mean, just if you look at a map, the Russians were hitting non-ISIS rebels just because they were happened to be the forces that were most immediately threatening Assad's coastal heartland. But at the same time, given what just happened in Afghanistan and given our involvement in a number of wars and conflicts, certainly in Pakistan on the border, we've inflicted our share of civilian casualties as well. And yes, we can make that point, but it's you know, Putin does have a counter for that, and that's one of the issues we're facing.
Does it ring hollow?
I think it does. You saw Foreign Minister Lavrov's comment about if it walks like a terrorist, if it fights like a terrorist, as far as they're concerned, it's a terrorist. We can't sort out the so-called moderates, which are the moderate terrorists and which are the not so moderate terrorists ourselves, even some of the ones we're aiding. I think at least they're taking a principled position to say, if you're on the other side and you're one of the groups that we know are terrorists, or you're fighting with them against what they consider to be the legitimate government, that's at least a framework to work in. Whereas on our side, we seem to have this confusion where we don't even know who's who, but we're going to fault them for bombing the wrong group.
Jim, Joshua, we'll run out of time, but thank you both for your analysis. Appreciate it.